Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board. I'm actually already here, been working for a little bit. But tonight, what I want to talk to you about is what I got in the mail today, which is George Alexopolous Mari Sue. This is an interesting example of an indie comic. It's got a bit of a different twist to it. And I'm going to go through it step by step and give it the usual drawing boarded breakdown. Let's start by talking about the form factor, because that's all the rage these days, talking about the print quality and all that jazz. This is an interesting case, both because it comes in a format very similar to a floppy that you would get from a comic shop, as opposed to, say, a square-bound paperback graphic novel that is very common in indie crowdfunding right now. It's also interesting because George has printed them himself and done all the finishing work himself. It seems that George says he has a background in digital printing, digital press work, and it shows. It's very hard to tell the difference between this and the quality of a actual DC or Marvel printed comic book. Actually, I would say the paper stock is maybe even better quality compared to some of the books I got from DC last year. The covers in particular are good quality paper. It uses staple binding just like you would expect from a big 2 book. And if I had a gripe about this, it would be that, and this is really nitpicking here, there is, as you can kind of see when you look at it, can you see that side on? Maybe that one doesn't show so well, but they're not pressed flat like a floppy you would get from the comic book store. And if I could make a recommendation, George, I would suggest that you do something to flatten this. It's not a big deal, but I would just like, the form factor a bit more if it had been pressed flat. I don't know if you can do that at home, but other than that, really good job. I am impressed. I know George spent a while talking about the research he was putting into this and all the work he was doing, and he's really been talking it up. And if everyone can do it at this quality for small runs, I could definitely see this being an option, assuming you wanted to print as floppy. I don't know how practical it is in some of these other formats, such as the square-bound paperback graphic novel format that is very popular right now. So let's talk a little bit about the art. Some people have been calling this book Tumblr art, and I don't know if I really agree with that. When I think of Tumblr art, I think of something that is really aping the styles of Cartoon Network, something like the Powerpuff Girls or Gravity Falls. And of course, that kind of art is not bad. If you look at Gravity Falls, that is a gorgeous show. Incredible art quality, incredible animation quality. Ditto for something like Panty and Stocking, if you've seen that. Similar style, of course that was produced in Japan, but excellent animation quality. There are, of course, much worse examples of this art style, but I consider it neither good nor bad. It's just a taste. That said, George does not have that style, does not have what I think of as a Tumblr style. That said, he does have a very loose style, and it's going to be very much to taste. If you're familiar with Narwhal, he has a style a lot like Narwhal's that is defined much more by form, by color, by shading than it is by detail work, by line work. And it is much looser and much sketchier, even in shots like this that you see on the cover of the first issue. The robot is kind of just a bunch of blocks of color in the background. And Mary herself, of course, is much higher res there. Her mentor is in the background yelling at her, and he too is basically just a bunch of blobs of color. That has an interesting effect of focusing your attention on Mary, on, of course, the helmet of the hermit crab, which is her mech suit here. And that really focuses your attention, but it's not going to be to everyone's taste. And of course, you can do the same thing using different styles of line work that are, more or less detailed. You can do the same thing just using lighting. You can do the same thing using coloring. So there are other ways to get the effect that George has achieved here, but that's just an effect of this is his style. He draws very sketchily, except where, the focus of your attention is supposed to be. And this is interesting because it reminds me of the book Manga in Theory and Practice by Hirohiko Araki, in which he says, draw the important stuff realistically. You may have heard a beeping there. I apologize. That's a battery backup telling me to replace the battery. Hopefully that won't happen again. But where was I? Yes, draw the important stuff as realistically as you can, and if everything else, just be representational. Give them enough to communicate the idea, and don't worry about it so much. George has said that he is a big fan of manga, and that kind of technique is very common in manga, so that may be where it comes from. This is part of the visual language of manga as a genre, and it may not be to your taste. This is not quite your traditional Western comic book, and has a lot more in common with Eastern books, like manga, like manhwa, like webtoons, if you're familiar with some of the Korean stuff on that website. It draws more from those artistic and storytelling traditions than it does, say, the storytelling traditions of Marvel or something like that. So, do I think it's bad? Well, George has a pretty good style for some things. If you look at this landscape here, man, that is gorgeous. I apologize for the glare. Let me see if I can. Okay. I really like these big wide shots. He has a couple of these in each book to give you a feel for this luxury cruise liner they're on, just sort of sailing through an outer space / interdimensional space kind of a thing. And man, that is really nice. It has great composition. It has great depth. It has great focus. And it really conveys a feel. And of course, you can see down here, here is a shot of Mary with Songbird, which is, well, more about him when we talk about the story. But, so you can see he has an understanding of the human form and anatomy, and he can do some pretty good posing, and his acting is so-so. Faces sometimes work really well, and sometimes they don't. Like here in this bottom panel, Songbird just looks like he's about ready to pass out from exhaustion. While on other panels, like here, he just looks like, he's happy, he's having a good time like he should. And in particular, the final page of the book, which I can't really show you, does a really good job of conveying an intensity of emotion. So it's kind of a mixed bag on that front. There are occasional lapses. In particular, this page, this bottom panel here, where Mary's being helped up in her mech suit. The positioning of her head just looks really awkward and maybe not. It's kind of off center, almost as if her spine comes down through her left shoulder. And I could kind of forgive that if this was a dynamic action scene, but it's not. I would like that human composition to be a little bit better. Of course, I would like my own human composition to be better in pretty much all of what I do. So, but it is definitely a lapse in the art. And here in this shot, I had a really hard time telling what exactly was going on. At first, I thought Mary was punching the big guy. She's not. She's actually kicking him. And these trailing energy lines, while they're a cool effect, they kind of cover enough of her body that I can't tell what's where. And then by the same token, all these lines on his body make it very hard to follow what's happening with his limbs. At first, I thought his leg was bent here, and his foot was supposed to be somewhere down here. And then, of course, no, his foot is actually in the foreground. It's very confusing. And then his hips, I don't know what's going on with his hips here. Again, this is a dynamic action shot. It's supposed to be kind of cartoony and exaggerated, just based on, George's style. It's weird. It doesn't work. I had a hard time telling what was going on when I looked at it. I can appreciate that he's going for a very dynamic fight scene here, but just in these couple of panels, it didn't work. Most of the fight scenes are pretty good. They're fun, they're dynamic, they're tense when they need to be tense, and they have a lot of impact and punch. So props to that. That art is good, but there are some areas that could use improvement. So yeah, on the whole, George is very good at exaggerated comedic moments, and he's a little less good at some of the more serious emoting. Although that's again hit and miss, because there's some stuff in here that I don't want to show that really does work well. Again, specifically the last page of this book, I like that. So let's talk about the story. Let's talk a little bit about the narrative. Mari Sue is aptly named. She is kind of a perfect person, it would seem, at first glance, or perhaps more accurately, she is kind of an imitation of what a lot of the bland, perfect protagonist is supposed to be. She's kind of a spoof of that. She's kind of Valley Girl. She just runs her mouth and says a lot of dumb stuff, unlike your typical blank protagonist. Instead of people just sort of laughing it off or ignoring it, it actually gets her a lot of flack from different people. Her mentor / adopted father is almost always pissed at her for causing social faux pas. Strangers avoid her. Even her pet fox doesn't seem to like her very much. It's rough. She throws tantrums like we see here on occasion. Doesn't really get along with people. But on the whole, it's clearly played more for laughs. She is obviously the odd one out in a world of fairly normal people. At the very least, when she's being an idiot, people give her crap for it. So that's more realistic than your typical blank protagonist from a story. So the heart of the story is pirates hijacking a cruise liner in outer space with mech suits. That's pretty cool if you ask me. It's a pretty good story. And it has some good parts, some bad parts. It's a little slow to get to the action. This is where the action actually kicks off, and as you can see, we're past the staple. I would honestly probably have had a cold open on Mari doing something really cool in her mech suit just to introduce the premise and to give us an opening action beat. Excuse me. Just so that we get to the action a little bit faster so that the story picks up earlier. That's my preference as a writer. Maybe George wanted to do it another way, but honestly, George, if I were to give you one piece of advice, and you ignored everything else, if you just picked up the story a little bit faster, got to the conflict a little bit earlier, I think it would have been, in your stories, it's going to be better overall. Of course, you can't go back and redo, well, you can go back and redo this one. If you do a reissue, you could just add a couple of pages before the beginning here, showing her in action. Like maybe just 2 pages of her beating the crap out of course, this is supposed to be before her first official contractor thing, but maybe it could be in the future, and you could have some dialogue that's flashing back to this. I don't know. Anyways, so it's a very basic premise. By the way, subtle. Yeah, I saw this, and this is a one time I kind of was pulled out of the story a little bit. I'm sure that most cruise ships are, in fact, gun-free zones. But this was a little bit on the nose, especially showing the pirates rushing in. I don't know really how I felt about that, but otherwise the storytelling is really good. Like you can see here that they're using Songbird's ID card. He's a janitor on the cruise ship, and they're using it to break into the bridge. There's a really good bit of visual storytelling that tells you that Songbird isn't on the up and up. Of course, he tells Mari that there are pirates on the ship earlier, but as just a guy who works there, that's the kind of thing he might just pick up through rumors. You never know. So a good bit of visual storytelling, requires zero dialogue, requires no exposition, narration boxes, nothing like that. It's just one panel on the page. Great visual storytelling. I like these pirates. They're a weird and wacky bunch. I like that the leader actually dresses like he's, a 15th, 16th century pirate. I love the weird medley of equipment they have. I love the fact that they steal panties and are generally not terribly serious. And I like the fact that in the second volume, they try and actually hire Mary's services, and there's like a 2 or 3 page of that. I thought that was a pretty good gag. Probably the strongest gag in here. All in all, the story is pretty good. It's clearly here to set up a long-term conflict with this group and introduce all the characters. I think it does that pretty effectively. I think there's the iconic Mary is shooting her rifle scene there. I think all in all, the story is effective at what it wants to do. It does it in 48 pages, which is not bad. I would have liked, and it does a respectable amount of world building as well, mostly in the first couple of pages. Although during the fight in here, we learn that there's an organized kind of mercenaries called contractors, and they work for just about anyone apparently, because the pirates try to hire her. There are a whole bunch of rules, like Mary is not actually contracted by the cruise ship company, so she winds up not being covered by the insurance apparently because she started fighting. There are actually she basically botches this fight, although it's impressive and she manages to handle the pirates fairly effectively. She's going to get charged for it. She doesn't actually bring them in because she has a crush on Songbird and he's working with the pirates. And she's going to have to get all this sorted in future episodes. That's very good storytelling. It sets up a long-running conflict. It shows us the strengths and weaknesses of the character. It shows her in relation to the important people in her life, namely her mentor and Songbird, which is all we have so far. And it shows us some of her flaws, her derpishness, for lack of a better term, and also her inability to really, it seems, deeply connect with people. Mary has a very shallow view of the world around her. So, on the whole, I think this story probably could have been cut down some. There's a bit of fluff. I don't really object to the long action sequence, but maybe, again, probably could have gotten to the action a little faster in the first volume, and or taken a little bit of the world building out of volume 1 and put an introductory action sequence in there to start out the story with a bang, rather than exposition, which is a little slow. I know it works in a lot of stories, but it's not my preference. So on the whole, the story is okay. It could use some improvements. It's not super ambitious. But again, George is inspired by manga as a medium, and there's usually an approximately 45 to 52 page introductory story in most manga series. So if he is looking to function within the tropes of that medium, he's actually doing very well. And the first chapter of a manga series is rarely groundbreaking unless you're Naoki Urasawa, because the man is a genius. Let's talk about what actually came with the campaign. Of course, there's Volume 1 and Volume 2, total of 48 pages of story. You get 2 front covers done by George, which are both pretty nice, although this one is more detailed and a little more artistic. Personally, I prefer this one, because it kind of puts you directly in the story as it stands in this volume, whereas this one is just sort of well, it's the premise of the story on a cover, so I guess in that respect it's good, but it's not super impactful, I think. On the back of this one, there's a really cool stat sheet that gives you some information about the hermit crab, which is Mari's mech suit. There's lots of cool information there. I especially like this video game-esque grid that gives all the stats for the suit. That's cool. Strengths and weaknesses, stuff like that. On this back, we have a pinup of Mari that's done, I believe, by Miss Sashi. Yes, right there. There's the signature. So that's pretty neat. There was a bookmark, which is pretty standard in campaigns. I'm not sure who this is on it. If it's supposed to be Mari Sue or if it's supposed to be someone else. There was also a trading card type thing. Let me grab that. Yep, forgot to bring that over. It's pretty nice looking. It came in this nice little holder, so it won't lose any of its ink as you caress it or whatever you do with these things. I don't know. This is probably just going to go in the front of one of these and on the shelf until I look at it. Also, each of these, of course, I didn't have them in the bag and board that came with them, but they did come bagged and boarded. Obviously, I can't use them as examples and talk about them if they're in the bags and boards, but that was there. That's pretty much all that came with it. It was, as I recall, a $15 project, maybe $12, one of the two, plus shipping and handling, of course. And that is, I think, a little bit pricey for what you get. Each of these are 28 pages. You get about 22 to 24 pages for $4 from DC. Of course, the paper stock quality, I think, is a little bit better. So there's that. The story quality is probably comparable to what you get in a mid-range DC comic. I don't know. I haven't read a lot of DC in the last year or so. So I don't know how that stacks up. You get about 4 to 6 pages more for essentially $7.50 a volume. That is a little bit pricey. Of course, you do get the card and the bookmark along with it, and of course you get a bag and a board, which you wouldn't get with just buying the book in the store. Well, it depends on the store, actually, but that's neither here nor there. So it's a little bit pricey. Of course, there is the added element of you are supporting a creator as they are up and coming. And that's always a good thing, assuming you like the creator. So $6 to $7.50 per volume, because I can't remember the amount of the campaign right off the top of my head. It's a little bit pricey, and I don't know if it's going to be worth it to everyone. I think the price point for what you get may be a sticking point for a lot of people. For me, I think that I'll probably back the second campaign and then decide whether I want to continue with it when I see how the larger story develops. So, what would I like to see going forward? Well, first of all, I would like to see more of the world brought in. Of course, I said you could have cut some of the world building from here, and that's true. I don't think you need as much world building as some people seem to want in the first part of a story. World building is something I look for more as you come to the middle of a story than at the beginning. So I would like to see some of that deeper world building, more about the universe going forward. I would like to continue to see the rather interesting internal conflict in Mari as she really learns to grow up and be less of a kid. And I would like to see, I think, a little bit more bang for the buck from campaigns going forward. So I don't know what that might include. The obvious thing is posters. Everybody seems to love posters. And I honestly don't know if the price point can be moved down. Again, George is inspired by manga, which is a fairly cheap reading experience. Of course, manga tends to be black and white with only a little bit of color. These are full color, so that's going to drive up the price point. those are things for George to think about as he goes forward. Lastly, and it kind of bugs me that this continues to be a point of contention, but a little bit about George as a creator. He is highly abrasive on social media, and as someone who has said, I as a creator want to be, I don't like that. It's not something I like to see. I don't think it matches with professional standards, customer service behavior. I have my standards for customer behavior or customer service behavior. I don't want to be seen feuding with other creators online. I believe that's a black eye in the profession. I think it's a black eye for people who do it, and I will, without hesitation, say that George is guilty of this. I'm also not into cancel culture. I'm not into call-out culture. I'm not going to try and tell other creators what they must do to continue to have my business. I don't like seeing it. I don't like seeing feuding online at all. If you can't sort it out in private, I don't see what just bitching about it in public improves. That said, I'm not going to stop following stories and projects that I see that seem interesting to me just because people are assholes. I wouldn't be able to do any of my own projects. I'd have to give them up because I'm an asshole. And George does seem to be improving. He reins it in. He tries to talk less about it. Sometimes he has outbursts that just frustrate me. Yeah, the one cardinal sin for me is he hasn't started a project without fulfilling it, and I think that's really the only thing. If you have another project going and you haven't fulfilled the last one, I can't support the project you're doing until I get what I've already given you money for. And obviously George has given me what I gave him money for, and that's on the level of am I going to buy his products again? That's the only hard stop. So long as they continue to look interesting, I'm willing to continue backing them, even though George is sometimes an asshole. That's all there is to it. And I would like not to, have to keep going over this, but people seem to keep bitching. Anyways, yeah, that's all I've got for tonight. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, there's a like button and subscribe button down below. You can leave a comment there too, and I'll talk to you later.